going to start, Bernard's going to tell us a little bit about the impetus for this event, which came from his recent book tour, and then we'll launch into a conversation.
Thank you, Ilana. When I had this idea, what I had in mind was, of course, more than my book tour, was the very famous title of Hannah Arendt, Men in Dark Times. As you know, Hannah Arendt in 1959 gave a very important lecture in Hamburg in Germany under the occasion of her receiving the Lessing Prize. And this was the stemming part of the next book, Men in Dark Times. What she meant when she said men in dark times was, of course, the age of totalitarianism, but more widely, a sort of state of uncertainty in which the whole world, according to her, was. When I called Susan Engel to propose this evening, I thought that the world is again in dark times because of the rise of populisms, because of the rise of Islamism, of course. I thought that America might enter in a sort of dark times also. And I thought that the Jews are, in particular, entering in a new dark times also. Because of the rise of the anti-Semitism, on the left and on the right. On the left with all these nasty campaigns, BDS in particular. On the right because of the billions of messages posted on Twitter according to the Anti-Defamation League during your recent election period. And beyond the case of anti-Semitism, I had the feeling that the Jews were compelled by the rise of a state of mind, a status of the truth, a relationship with what they have most precious, which is knowledge and study, which is completely opposite to themselves, to their tradition, to their highest values. So I had this feeling that, unfortunately, opposite to what we believed maybe 20 years ago when the communism fell, we were entering again in dark times. Mm-hmm. When Hannah Arendt wrote her Men in Dark Times, as you well know, she opposed to the dark times two things: the will for truth and the sense of friendship. The two things which she opposed, who were, according to her, the tools of resistance to this darkness, was the truth and the friendship. That's why I called you, because when I imagined this event, I tried to figure out who were in this city those who are really embodied with the sense of the truth, very important in this time of alternative truth and of alternative facts, and who were my friends, my real friends having the same relationship to this world which I have myself. And of course, I thought of you and of David Samuels. I thought of my friend Paul Berman. We have already nearly a long story of friendship. And I thought of Léon Wieseltier, who is also for me one of my friends according to spirit in this city. So this is this is the history of this event, how it started, how it stemmed, and why we are here tonight.
To that end, I was hoping that maybe we could begin with Leon, telling us, actually, giving us a little bit of context for what it is that we're looking at here. What is there anything qualitatively different in the time that we're living now? And how would you articulate what you see going on, so that before we talk about what there might be to do about it, it might be helpful to actually talk about what it is?
Sure, I'll make a few general remarks and then get to the question of the Jews, as opposed to the Jewish question. I think that the rise of Trump, and I'll talk about the American situation since we're here, though there are obviously ominous European parallels, represents the rise of a kind of populist authoritarianism that has never reached this level of power in our country. If you read, or if you heard, there's no reason to read it, Trump's inaugural address, I hate that phrase, by the way, but if you read Trump's inaugural address, you will have heard him describe the situation as follows. There are the people, and there is the leader. And the leader perfectly understands the people. The people feel that the leader will fix all their problems. And all these other things around us, all the institutions of politics and all the institutions of government are obstacles and impediments to the will of the people. It is a kind of coarse Rousseauist fantasy with a dream of unanimity, you know, as if there is such a thing as the people, as if the people are monolithic, as if the leader has some epistemologically privileged access to what, and so this represents a delegitimation and an attempt at deconsolidation of the democratic institutions that we know. And that is deeply alarming. Now, part of this delegitimation and deconsolidation includes certain policies, and the reversal of certain policies that are also deeply odious on moral grounds.
I just want to, just to get specific though, there was a delegitimization of those institutions going on before January of this year.
There is a difference between polarization and gridlock, which, by the way, was what our Constitution designed our system for. You know, the gridlock and polarization in Washington was awful, but it was kind of a reductio ad absurdum of Federalist 10, of the idea that faction and conflict are a permanent feature of human life and a permanent feature of human politics, and the answer to it is not a strong leader recognizing the will of the people, but compromise. Now we have people in the White House, not all of them, because the White House is now an immensely incoherent place, and exceeded in its incoherence only by the president's own mind. But there are people in the White House now who really do believe in the atrophy and the rejection of democratic and liberal institutions, who bring to mind European figures from the late 19th and early 20th century. And so that, I think, is the general picture. I mean, one can get more detailed about the breakdown of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but that we can talk about that later.
Well, so tell me how then, and at some point I want Paul to jump in too, tell me then how what's going on in the White House or in the federal government or in DC, which may or may not, we don't know how long is gonna last, could last a year, it could last 8 years, we don't know.
Just be prepared for the long haul, yeah.
Why does it mean anything for the world around it? Is there actually qualitatively or quantitatively more anti-Semitism in the country? Does it get mirrored from leadership? How does it work?
I think, well, there are two questions. How it affects the world around it, that's really about what happens when the United States withdraws from the world, which was a process begun by Obama, by the way. There are going to be, it's heretical to say so, but historians will note real continuities in foreign policy. And if you were going to run a laboratory experiment about what the world will look like if the United States withdrew and no longer came to the assistance of allies and peoples and Democrats and so on, voila, these are the results. We're seeing the findings. About the Jews, I'm a little bit I have a rather complicated and minority position here. I think that it's very important the situation of anti-Semitism in Europe is different from the situation of anti-Semitism in the United States for the following reason. First of all, I should say I don't believe the president is an anti-Semite. I think he's just generally coarse. And you know, he doesn't, there is anti-Semitism in what I call the Trump sewer, in the sort of the larger political culture. What happened, you know, two events happened. It wasn't just that the Republicans nominated Trump. The other event was that the far right took Trump over.
Right.
That was a separate event.
Right.
And those people, I mean, the anti-Semitism that always existed in the United States, two things have happened. One, we have it on our iPhones now, so that people like us, to speak perfectly provincially, are no longer insulated from knowledge of its reality. And secondly, there is a leader in the White House who came to power in part by legitimating or allowing or not responding or quashing these ugly instincts. But I will say that I do not believe that this event, that these horrible events in the United States are primarily or in some way even significantly about the Jews. My own view, you know, Jews are very funny. They like to think that whenever there's a major historical change, it must be about the Jews. But actually, they're not coming for us. They're coming for Muslims, Mexicans, immigrants, and refugees. That's who they're coming for. There are immigrants in this country right now who are afraid to leave their apartments because they might get picked up by a cop. And if there is a terrorist attack in this country, God forbid, I worry not about the implications abroad, because he's not taking us to war. I worry about what would happen domestically. You know, Jabotinsky, whom I don't often quote, in his testimony to the Peel Commission made a very famous distinction. He made a distinction between the anti-Semitism of men and the anti-Semitism of things.
Right.
By the anti-Semitism of things, he meant something like what other people in other subjects call systemic racism, that sort of thing. My own view is he was describing Europe, and I think that he was right about Europe, that in Europe there was not just the anti-Semitism of men, but also the anti-Semitism of things. In the United States, I have to say, for a whole variety of political and philosophical reasons that we can talk about, I believe we have the anti-Semitism of men, but not the anti-Semitism of things.
Paul, you can pick up on that directly, which might be an interesting place for you to start. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on where you think we are right now.
I want to address your question of what is new.
Right.
So what I think is new is that the Islamist movement has scored an immense victory, and it's done it in this way. The entire goal of the Islamist movement has always been to impose its own categories of thought on other people. It is an ideological movement with an ideological goal. The first people it wants to impose its categories of thought on is the rest of the Muslim world. But it also wants to impose its categories of thought on everyone else, meaning us. And it has had several successes which add up to a considerable progress, which is something new. It has succeeded in imposing its categories of thought on the left, on a large part of the left, not everybody, but a large part of the left, and on the right.
Since when?
In the case of the left, it's been a process that's been going on for perhaps 40 years, beginning. We could note it from the period when the Soviet Union and the Arab states were arguing for the thesis, Zionism is racist. And this began to be picked up. In the case of the right, well, I'll describe. The categories of thought that are accepted in a large part of the left are, one, an acceptance of the Islamist paranoia that the rest of the world is oppressing the Muslims, and the oppression must be resisted. So a large part of the left has accepted the idea that we must mobilize ourselves chiefly against Islamophobia, meaning opposition to an idea, and we must censor ourselves. We must censor ourselves we must prevent ourselves from speaking in ways that are, would normally be customary to ourselves. Second, the Islamist movement believes that it is under attack from a vast Zionist conspiracy, something cosmic. And a large part of the left has accepted that Zionism poses a worldwide threat. It is not a local issue. It is something that should be addressed in every possible forum, whether it be, no matter what the issue. And a large number of people have begun to agree with this. Some people on the moderate left in one version, and people in the radical left in another version. The Islamist movement also believes that the world is defined by a religious war of Islam against the rest. This is what's been accepted on the right. And this is something new in the United States. George W. Bush, for all his flaws, never believed that. But we now have a president who believes that. That's the meaning of the Muslim ban, which he's having trouble imposing, but he will succeed in imposing it. The Muslim ban means that our president has accepted the fundamental Islamist idea of a struggle between Islam, which they claim to represent, and the rest of the world. And he's responded by saying he accepts it, therefore he's going to oppose Muslims as a whole. And here's the consequence of that. The notion of religious freedom is the single fundamental, the single most important, the single fundamental, the origin of liberal civilization. It is the rock on which everything else is built. You cannot remove that principle. If you've removed that principle, if we say that we no longer accept religious freedom, if we say that, then we are no longer affirming liberal principle. Everything follows from that. If we are no longer affirming liberal principle, then why should the United States persist in trying to be a world power? Why should the United States continue what it has been doing for 70 years? Why not retreat from that?
I don't think that you and Leon are disagreeing, but there is an interesting.
We can if you want, but I mean.
But there's an interesting question about how central the Jews are to the question of what's happening today. Following from I could draw a very clear line from what you just spoke about, but it's interesting to follow it in context of what you said. So the question is can we articulate what we think the challenge is for Jews in this country right now, and maybe what it should be?
Can I just add something to what Paul said with Bernard's permission?
And I'd like you to actually.
I just want to add one sentence. I agree with what Paul said, but I think that the Islamist threat to democracy is now joined by another and even more powerful threat to Western democracy, and that is Putin. Right. Putin and Putinism. I think that if you look at Putin's role in our election was completely typical of his behavior. That's been the case in Europe for a very long time. And if there is any figure or ideology in the world today that presides over the deeply anti-democratic tendencies, the new illiberalism, it's Putin. And it's this toxic simultaneity of Islamism and Putinism that together combines to make democracy under threat.
And Trumpism, because Trump is the first and only American president in all of history to be pro-Russian tyranny. Mm-hmm. And he was elected on that basis. He said he was. People voted for him.
You're right. Henry Wallace lost, right?
Henry Wallace did lose. The Republican Party supported him. And it's logical for Trump to be pro-Putin, because if we no longer stand for a liberal civilization, then we no longer have a duty vis-a-vis the rest of the world, in which case, why not let Putin do it?
Bernard, can you give us your view from where you stand of how you think these forces are operating on America from the perspective that you have outside of it?
First of all, if you look at the things from the point of view of Europe, it is true that there is today an attack on democracy which comes from the two sides, from the Putin side and for the Islamic side. It's an attack on the principles of democracy, and this is completely new. Mm-hmm. Number two, the Jews, you say, Léon, are not the center of the world. Of course. The center of the world today, probably the most crucial question, is the question of Islam, of what is happening inside Islam. The question which is erased by all the fundamentalist Islamist movements and by Trump and by Putin is the real question of what is going on, not between the rest and the West, but inside the rest, in the world of Islam, between Islam and Islam. This battle of civilization, this clash of civilization inside Islam is the most burning issue of today, the fight between the liberals and the autocrats, the Democrats and the terrorists. This is probably the most important battle we have to face today and we have to confront and maybe to participate in, which Putin, Trump, and ISIS in combination agree not to consider. But number three, what is happening with the Jews? And what gave me the idea of proponing this event tonight. And what is happening with the Jews in America, even if they are not at the center of the world and even if they are not the biggest targets of what, it is true that it is better still today to be a Jew in New York than a Mexican in San Diego, for sure. Nevertheless, something new has happened. And from a European perspective, it's so obvious. For a European and for a French, America has always been a safe haven for the Jews. Wait, there is two fatherlands for Jews, except theirs, which is Israel and America. When the Jews were prosecuted, when Ernst Kantorowicz was prosecuted, when Hannah Arendt, America was the safe haven. For the first time today, this is what I feel, and this is what a lot of Americans feel, anti-Semitism is taking root again, or the roots are beginning to bloom in America also. The slogan of Donald Trump, you spoke of the campaign, America First. Donald Trump knows what America First means.
Actually, he doesn't.
But he does. The first time he used it in the campaign was in an interview with the New York Times, and the journalist of the New York Times told him, Mr. Trump, are you aware that America First is a Nazi slogan used by those who did not want to imply America in the resistance against Hitler? The journalist of the New York Times said it in proper terms to Trump. It was a slogan of those who did not want America to enter in this war between the Jews and the Nazis. Trump said, yes, I know that. But, quote, I'm looking to the future, not to the past. And when, during the inauguration...
Nazi in the good sense. Yes, right.
During the inauguration day, when he repeated on and on, America First, he knew exactly what he was doing, that he was opening a Pandora box in which the Jews appear as the warmongers of our time, according to which the Israel question is the biggest source of crisis of the world, and so on. So there is something happening here. And I believe that the new anti-Semitism today in the world has changed its narrative. We all know that. Anti-Zionism is part of it. Denial of Holocaust is part of it. And competition between victims is part of the new anti-Semitism. When you hear what is happening here in America, you have to admit, and this did not exist 10 years ago, that these three narratives are finding a beginning of expression also here. Denial of Holocaust, I'm sorry, but the day of the remembrance of Holocaust, when the word Jews was erased from the communique of the White House, it was in the draft of the State Department. It was erased by the White House. And the Holocaust appeared as a sort of vague episode, taking a vague place in the big picture of the history of massacres. It was denial of Holocaust. And when the White House said that it was a fault that the speech had been written by an Holocaust survivor called, I don't remember the name.
Boris Epstein.
Epstein. This was so disgusting. It was the denial of Holocaust plus the insult to the memory of the victims. So this for me
so wait,
is the
you've
new
convinced me
event.
that there's a problem. Okay. Now what? What should we do? Yes, Leon,
all
what
right.
should we do?
Well, I think we have to do a number of things. I think that reiterating my belief that the Jews in this country are not under threat, I think that our defense organizations should do their work, which they're doing. I think, but more importantly, I think that the Jews have the most powerful interest of the Jews historically and morally lies in a strong America. I think that a weak America, no matter how many times Trump says nice things to Netanyahu, if this country is weakened abroad, is weakened globally, if we no longer come to allies' defense and protection, if we withdraw ourselves into ourselves, that would be the greatest blow to Israel that I could imagine. Because a strong and active America is one of the very pillars of Israel's security, if we're talking about Israel. I think that no ethnic group has benefited more from or kindled more enthusiastically to the liberal order than the Jews did here in the United States. It's not clear to me why, but the Jewish addiction to democratic practices is one of the central narratives of American Jewish history. And I think that we need to argue and agitate for liberal values of the sort that are now being delegitimated. This is a struggle. This is not, she won by 3 million votes. I'm not saying he's illegitimate. I hate the illegitimacy thing. He got elected president. But there was not a landslide for Trump. There was not a mandate for Trump. There is a powerful struggle over first principles that needs to take place now in this country.
I'm just going to push you, and then I'm going to push Paul on it, because I've heard you say and write in other places that Trump's foreign policy can and probably will be seen as an extension of Obama's foreign policy, which you referenced. So if that's true, then why would it have been? We don't know whether or not
there's a huge difference, which is that with Obama, and Obama didn't walk the walk, but in a way that was really repulsive, he talked the talk. And in the case of Obama, you could still make arguments, as some of us did, futilely, but as some of us did, summoning America back to its internationalist values and its liberal values and to its alliances and to the principles of the post-war order and so on. And you would hope that you could shame them in some way or accuse. Now, with these people, there are no such principles to summon them back to. They are quite candid that they reject that order and they reject those principles.
But the shaming didn't work with the Obama administration.
Well, in the case of Syria, it didn't
Right.
work disastrously. In the case of Israel, it was complicated. I mean, America's allies were not happy with Obama, but America's allies are now completely panicked. It's sauve qui peut out there in the world right now.
Paul, can you?
I can answer Leon's question about why had the American Jews felt addicted to democracy. And it's because liberal civilization begins with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And the first thing that liberal civilization does is emancipate the Jews. It does this in the United States, George Washington's famous letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, and it does it in the French Revolution. And It's because, the liberal revolutions do that because it is the nature of liberalism to do that. It is the nature of liberal civilization to emancipate the oppressed groups and to come out against the oppression of religions. The fate of the Jews today is going to depend on liberal civilization. What we have to do is defend the concept of liberalization, liberal civilization. We have a president who no longer believes in that. He believes in business dealings. He believes in self-interest. He does not believe in the liberal principles. That's why he's withdrawing from the world. That's why he's turning things over to Putin. This was not the case with Obama. Obama was more complicated, less consistent. With Trump, it is clear, and worse, the people have voted for this. Trump is the first president in American history who visibly, at a glance, is unfit to be president, and people voted for him anyway. He's the first person really to be unqualified to deal with the questions of the day. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows it in Washington. He's the president anyway. He was selected to do that. The very fact of electing him means that as a country, we have retreated from the principles, which I think are the principles of the American Revolution. Liberal civilization, rationality, fact, open debate, resistance to demagogy, that kind of thing. What we have to do then is something beyond struggling for this or that policy. We have to maintain some kind of sense of principle, and in the hope of bringing it to people's attention, and in the United States and worldwide.
What we have to do, I would say, first of all, hope. We have to hope that at the end of the day, a Trump administration emerges. I'm coming these last days, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was with Kurdish friends who had come from Erbil and from nearly the battlefield of Mosul, and they came in an official visit to see their counterparts in America, their allies, to decide what is the next step for this very important battle against ISIS, which is the Battle of Mosul. A very high-level delegation of Kurds. They found no one to speak with.
Right.
The state is empty.
Right.
The king is naked. The White House governs between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning by Twitters. And there is no one to decide. If there was, and my friend, Dr. Fouad, who is the main advisor of President Barzani, told me, be careful. If today you had a financial crisis or a nuclear alert with a crazy North Korean, I believe that nothing would happen in this country because there would be no one to decide and no vision of what has to be decided. So number one, what we have to do, hope that there is an administration. Number two, about Islam. Hope about Islam. Instead of banning the Muslims, what we have to do is to help those who inside the Muslim world fight for liberal values. Those who believe that Islam is not adverse to liberal values, to human rights, to equality between men and women, and so on. And for the Jews, what we have to do, my feeling, and I think is very important in this crucial moment, is to make no compromise with the running populism. After the election of Trump, I think there was, during the visit of Netanyahu in Washington, there was a temptation to make compromise. There was a temptation to deal with this current populism. My belief is that it would be a fatal mistake for the Jews in America, for the Jews in the world, for the Jews in Israel, to make a compromise with this terrible populism will be a moral, an intellectual, and a political mistake on long term and maybe on short term.
And Before we throw the conversation out to questions from the audience, I don't want to be hopelessly practical here, but when we talk about the Jews, the truth of the matter is the American Jewish community does not have the leadership organizations or the membership organizations that it had 50 years ago. What practically does it mean for American Jews, other than being hysterical on Facebook? What does it mean for us to actually stand by the principles that we need to be standing by?
Well, that's easily enough answered. I mean, we have to support immigration and come to the assistance of our brothers and sisters who are immigrants, legal and illegal. It means that we have to argue for a strong American presence in the world. It means that, I mean, these are not Jewish, I mean, these are things that link up to Jewish values and Jewish interests, but they are American causes that are necessary to secure the safety and the flourishing of the Jewish community here. I mean, again, I have to say, I don't know when you say, what are we supposed to do? I don't believe that the village is burning. I really don't. You know, we all have journalist friends. We've all gotten, even before Twitter, some of us got all kinds of nasty anti-Semitic messages. I mean, I once wrote something about the Jews, and they arrived to the offices. You may recall there was once a magazine called The New Republic, and there arrived to me in an envelope during feces wrapped in aluminum foil, which is a very harsh form of criticism. But you know, I had Jewish journalist friends who during the campaign, every time some anti-Semite, some crackpot somewhere put something on Twitter, they acted like it was the Kishinev pogrom. And it wasn't. It wasn't. I think that there are, as I say, historical, political, philosophical reasons. The United States is a revolution in Jewish history too, because it offers the Jews a bargain that was not the European bargain. We could go into that another time. But there's no question in my mind that as a matter of principle and politics, we are more secure here. This is, I call it, a diaspora that is not an exile. This is a different sort of place. And I know that the Germans said the same thing. I understand all that, to which my response is they were wrong and I am right. I mean, it just, I really do believe that. And so I think that our defense organizations, the ADL is doing a terrific job. I mean, and we have to keep building political coalitions with all the parties, et cetera.
I do want to just say
Or
that
you want us to say Tillim. I know what you want us to do.
I want us to say Tillim, yeah,
Yes.
right. I do want to say that I feel, the one comment I will make is I definitely feel the energy from American Jews to want to do something, and a little bit of a sense of feeling lost as to where they're supposed to direct that energy, practically speaking. So, Paul, maybe you could
Yes,
make a comment here.
I think that one of the reasons we find ourselves in the United States in our present situation is that there's been something of a cultural collapse, which is also an institutional collapse. Trump is the president because somehow the Republican Party collapsed. Trump does not come out of the traditions of the Republican Party. He imposed himself on it, and the party found no way to oppose him, didn't have the morale to oppose him, didn't have the sense of principle to oppose him, and he ended up in power. Another institution which is collapsing, and which is part of the larger cultural collapse, is journalism. Journalism is collapsing. There are less than, there's something like half as many jobs for journalists in the United States as there were at the beginning of this century. Every single institution of journalism is struggling. It's very easy to imagine the greatest institutions of journalism collapsing. In some degree, they already have. So what the Jews should do is not any different from what I think other people should do, but I think it is fairly clear. There has to be a defense of institutions, and the first political institution that should be defended is, I think, the Democratic Party. That we haven't in the past thought of ourselves as having to do such a thing, but we do have to do such a thing. And the second institution that has to be defended is the press.
In other words, we should start a journal.
So we've been given a load of questions. We only have about 20 minutes or so, so let's see how many we could get in. Maybe we'll do a lightning round at the end. The first question is for Bernard. How much evidence is there of a real internal fight in Islam?
How much evidence?
Or maybe what is the
I
evidence?
know. There is evidence everywhere. There are some Muslim countries which are, in their majority, on the side of liberal values and democratic values. For example, Kurdistan. Kurdistan is the Kurdistan in Iraq, which is nearly a state, is a Muslim country devoted to human rights, practicing equality between women and men, faithful to secularism, open to the its Jewish past, and protecting the Christian minorities. This is one example. I know that not so bad. I made 2 documentaries about the Kurds. The second one, which is, by the way, screened tomorrow night at the French Institute. And I know that by first-hand experience, Kurdistan is the living proof that Islam and democracy are compatible. Bosnia, 22 years ago, during the war against the Serbs, the Bosnians who were fighting for European values, for European civilization, at such a heavy cost, were the living proof also that there is something which can match between Islam and democracy. In the rest of the world, you have a fight, a heavy fight, which, of course, in other places, is for the moment won by the Islamists, with some precise battles, the right to enter in the faith and the right to step out from the faith, which is a decisive battle, is far from being won in a lot of Muslim countries. But this evidence, you have it everywhere. There is another country which I know rather well and which I like, which is Morocco. In Morocco, there is a strong trend in favor of the rights of the women, of the opening of the Jewish roots of the country, the Jewish memory, and so on. So the situation is not at all desperate. And in France, there is a strong Muslim anti-Semitism, of course, but there is also a huge part of the Muslim community, probably the majority, who does not want to deal with that, who does not accept this anti-Semitism, and which stands against it. So a battle, by definition, is undecisive. Nobody knows who will win, but I will certainly not say that it is lost by the Democrats.
Leon.
Yes.
Is not 240 years of America's story strong enough to overcome the present concerns?
No.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think, look, I guess I think of it this way. It is imprecise to speak about the West. There is the European West and the American West. Mm-hmm. And on the question of tolerance, diversity, otherness, we have 2 very different traditions. In the European tradition of modern European nationalism, it holds what I think of as a kind of theory of the perfect fit, that every nation should be incarnated in a state and every state should represent a nation, which means that the political and the cultural boundaries should coincide. Since they never coincide, there existed this thing, and still does, called the problem of minorities. Mm-hmm. Now, what this does not acknowledge, what it has no natural understanding of, is the idea of multi-ethnicity, of the multi-ethnic state. Mm-hmm. Not of the state with the native and the foreigner, or the majority and the minority, but of the multi-ethnic state. That is why, for example, I think that the current crisis in Europe, the refugee crisis, everything that we're seeing, can have only 2 possible conclusions. One is the resurgence of fascism, and a return to certain European traditions that are still alive, and the other is the breakthrough of certain European societies into a new appreciation of the multi-ethnic state. The United States, by contrast, has been de facto a multi-ethnic state, and certainly since the 60s, actually regards itself and prides itself on being a multi-ethnic state. In Europe, the classical modern canard against the Jews was that they were a state within a state.
Right.
In the United States, it makes no sense to attack anyone
Except
for
for New
being a
York.
state within a state, because everybody is, here we are a hyphenated people. I think this has both political and philosophical implications. And so in that sense, I really do believe that whereas there is anti-Semitism in the United States, and whereas recently certain important politicians have allowed themselves to batten from its flames, and whereas there are precincts of American political culture that will always demonize the Jews as they demonize other groups, as I said before, to use Jabotinsky's language, this is the anti-Semitism of men and not the anti-Semitism of things. And in that sense, we fight anti-Semitism as a moral obligation and as an obligation of self-defense, but I think that the political and philosophical context here is genuinely different. So that's how I would answer that.
Paul, whither Jewish socialism?
Yeah, Paul.
Okay. Before I turn to Jewish socialism, I want to add a note to Bernard's comment regarding Muslim liberals. There are, in addition to the various forces and nations that he mentioned and struggles that he mentioned, there is an entire class of liberal Muslim intellectuals.
That's right.
And the reason why they are not as well known as they should be is because, first, they are persecuted by the Islamists, and in many places they're subject to violent attack. They are murdered or they're threatened. They have to flee into exile. Second, they come under attack by the PC police in the liberal countries, who are really the fellow travelers of the Islamists, and they are denounced as people without roots, as notorious ideologues, as bad people in one way or another. But really, there's a substantial number of these people, and writers of the highest level. Sitting next to Bernard reminds me of one of his friends who died a year or two ago, Abdel Wahab Medeb, one of the finest French writers of our time, the perfect representative of the liberal Muslim idea. What should the Jews be doing? The Jews should be supporting these people. No one else is supporting these people.
Would it help?
Of course it would help. That everyone needs support. That the magazines that should exist, the books that should be promoted, all of this would help. And what would certainly help would be not doing the wrong thing. We've only to think back on Brandeis University a couple of years ago to see an example of a Jewish institution lending itself to the Islamist campaign against the free-thinking liberal intellectuals from Muslim backgrounds. So
you're not getting away with that
we
without
could do
talking
exactly
about
what
socialism.
we did with the dissidents of Soviet Union.
That's exactly right.
We did that, and we thought they were a minority, that there was a salt of the earth, and so on. At the end of the day, they made it, and they achieved the revolution. So the same scheme for the press, for the intellectuals, should apply to these dissidents of Islamist Islam.
I just want to say, but is the part of the problem with Jewish organizations that because these thinkers come under assault from the PC left, there's a resistance to taking them on in the way that we took on Soviet dissidents? Would you say you think that that's part of the challenge?
I do think that people feel inhibited to take them on. They're intimidated. They're intimidated by the Islamists. They're intimidated by the PC PC police. They're intimidated by the idea, by the theory which might lie behind this question, that there can't be Muslim liberals. So therefore, if someone is a Muslim liberal, this person must, by definition, either have something wrong with them or be an inconsequential person. I think that's absolutely a task. Now, Jewish socialism.
Yeah, that's right.
Jewish socialism. You know, in New York especially, we have a really magnificent tradition of Jewish socialism. And the Jewish socialist tradition ought to tell us exactly what we can do. The Jewish socialist tradition was something that came out, was a democratic socialist tradition, 90%. It came out of Russia, out of the Menshevik traditions of Russia and the Bund. It built in this city the powerful trade unions and many other institutions. And what those institutions did in the period when they were flourishing, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and for a while after, what they did was to maintain a policy of their own, even a foreign policy of their own. Remember back to the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt was not leading an anti-Nazi campaign. The United States in the 1930s was an isolationist country. The right wing was isolationist and sympathetic to the fascists. The left wing was isolationist without being sympathetic to the fascists. Where was the force? Where was the pressure in America, for America to intervene, for America to play a role in Europe? It came from the single most important place that was the source of that pressure for the United States was the Jewish unions, the socialist unions in New York and Chicago and elsewhere. Those unions played a tremendous role, and they continued to play a tremendous role after the war in supporting the Soviet dissidents. Mm-hmm. So that's an example for us. If you look back at the history of a magnificent institution like the Jewish Labor Committee, which no one even remembers anymore, but it exists, and its tradition is completely and totally admirable and heroic. In the 1930s, the Jewish Labor Committee was sending its own agents into Europe to rescue trade unionists, to rescue socialists, rescue intellectuals. They had their agents in the Warsaw Ghetto. They had their own foreign policy. That's what we need.
Leon, do you believe that impeachment is feasible based on the Russian controversy?
I pray for it every morning, but I mean, but look, I think that I think we have to, as I said, have to prepare ourselves for the long haul. Based on everything that I have read and based on the ferocity of Trump's enthusiasm for Putin, I have to believe that there is something there that we don't know, and I have to believe it's about money and not about sex, because I'm not sure how you shame this man sexually. But I don't know anything more than anybody else does. The Republicans may actually, I mean, if you think about who the Republicans are, they would be very happy with a President Pence. He's one of their own. It would be, and who knows? But right now, the Republican Party is as broken as the Democratic Party is broken. So, I mean, I have no way to know. I used to, I'll tell you, I generally don't like thinking in terms of impeachment because I think it would tear the country apart in some way. Mm-hmm. But my view is that the country is already being torn apart, and this will not end except through a struggle. And so I don't false pleas, sentimental pleas for unity, and that's all very nice, but usually one side benefits from it and another side doesn't.
Do you agree with that?
An impeachment supposes a cause and a will, a real cause, a real ground. Does this ground exist? It seems. We have never seen a president in this great country, the greatest democracy in the world, paying such a tribute to the head of an if not enemy, adversary state. So there is probably ground. After that, you have to have a will. My feeling is that, I'm again an observer from outside, the will can only be the one of the Republican Party. From outside, I feel that the mood has changed since January. In January, the people I know, at least in the Republican Party, seem to be resigned to the Trump phenomenon. They seem to have decided that they had to deal with it. Now, I feel in the same people a sort of rage, hatred, and absolute political despair. So there might be a will. And a will plus a ground can make an impeachment. About, if I may add one point, about intimidation, what Paul said about, and what you said. At the time when the European and American intellectual and liberals supported the dissidents in the Soviet Union, there was the same intimidation as today when we support the moderate Muslims. The same. The supporters of the dissidents was treated as, was qualified as fascist. They were qualified as agent of the CIA. It was said that instead, far from helping the dissidents, we were digging more deep their grave. So the intimidation worked exactly the same way. And I find the same mechanism at work against those who want to extend the hand to Abdelawab Medeb, Malek Shebel, Kamel Daoud, all the dissidents of Islam, as it worked when we extended the hand and opened our doors and our hearts and our countries to Solzhenitsyn in Vermont, to Pliouch in London, to Bukowski in London. It is the same way. We must not let us intimidate by the same autocratic and tyrannic forces that told us the same old bad fairy tale at this time in today.
Oh, but the difference between then and now is that we had, just to pick up on one of Paul's other points, we had an operative press that was a mediating institution in American life, and we have a different animal right now. And I wonder whether or not that also plays a role in the effect and the power of those that we could put behind those people. Do you think? No.
The same social media that is used to denounce these people can be used to admire and to praise them.
But it won't, because that's not what Twitter is
Well, but
designed
that's
for.
because people, I think Paul and both my friends are right. I think that, look, insofar as we are now made vulnerable by an internecine struggle within Islam, right? And we can all argue what the struggle is and so on. And one of the greatest failings of American journalism in the last 20 years, and I think this is true of European journalism too, is not to have reported on the war of ideas that is happening within Islam. And there are secular liberals and there are also religious liberals. We don't hear anything about them and none of us read the languages. But insofar as our fate is now being affected by this internecine struggle, we have to believe, we have to support and do everything we can to bring about something remotely resembling a moment of enlightenment within the Islamic world. Now, this has not happened yet, but as Bernard says, the struggle is not over. The American press and American intellectuals, by and large, have not been favorably disposed to this particular crusade. They just have not. They just have not, for all the reasons that have been said.
There are a couple of questions that all get at the same idea, so I'm just going to ask one of them and ask all of you, if you can, to talk about your thoughts on it, which is, roughly, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism, and how much of what we're seeing in what's concerning about the contemporary climate is anti-Zionism, and how much is it anti-Semitism, and what is there to do about it? You're all pointing at each other. Somebody has to answer the question.
I think we all have the same answer.
What is it?
Well, you,
Paul.
I don't find the question interesting because anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism amount to the same thing. I prefer the term anti-Zionism, and that's because anti-Semitism is an archaic term that makes people think of matters that might have arisen in 1910 or 1920, and it's a relatively simple thing from the perspective of a certain kind of sentimentality of the present. The really formidable problem, I think, is anti-Zionism. Now, by anti-Zionism, the real anti-Zionism is a supernaturalist idea. It is the idea that the Zionist project is a project to dominate the world, and that Israel is a force for evil worldwide. So it is a supernatural idea. This is obviously bears a historic relation to anti-Semitism, but it's enough to speak about anti-Zionism. And what's shocking is that we have to have a struggle against anti-Zionism in what ought to be the centers of enlightenment in the United States. The universities are the worst place, and the humanities departments are the worst of the worst, and the English departments, the French departments are just dreadful. One scholarly discipline after another has voted for or has barely avoided voting for some kind of anti-Zionist program. So we should address ourselves to anti-Zionism. And it's not done. It's not done even by the organized Jewish world. What you see happening in one place after another is the BDS movement in the universities or other things like that. They're opposed by lawyers who try to prevent the universities from having such speakers who might be hostile to Israel. They're done by pressure campaigns against the board of trustees of some university. They're done in a variety of ways, in every single way, except for standing up and openly arguing against anti-Zionism. That's what needs to be done.
Bernard?
Anti-Zionism, no, it's a crazy story because why should anti-Zionism, which is the hate of the founding principle of one of the smallest countries in the world, become a world ideology? This is completely strange. It's a new world ideology. It's a sort of new religion starting from the hate of the founding stones of the little state of Israel. The only explanation for that is that it is the other name of anti-Semitism. And for me, the real question is not, as it is often asked, are all anti-Zionists anti-Semites? The real way of saying it is that you cannot be anti-Semite today except if you are anti-Zionist. The only way to express an acceptable anti-Semitism, a comestible anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitism which can spread, is to express it through the wording and the narrative of anti-Zionism. I would like to add also one word about the press. What you said about the press. I'm less pessimistic than you are, because I remember again of the climate of the 70s and the 80s. And you remember, both of you too. The situation was not better with the PC of this time. The defenders of the dissidents of the dissents of this time were absolutely blacklisted, bullshitted by most of the press. And remember, the leftist press, the situation was much worse when we defended Solzhenitsyn than when we in the press than when we defend today Abdelwahab Medeb. So I don't think that the collapse of the press, maybe the press is in the process of collapsing, but it is not the main explanation of the weakness for the moment of this moderatism. The situation is maybe better than it was 20 years ago.
I would add only this, and I mean, I agree with everything my comrade said about anti-Zionism. But I would add that I have a complaint against American Jewry, which is that American Jews have forgotten how to argue for Zionism. I think that No, but I mean something very specific here. I don't just mean to be uplifting. I think that if you ask most American Jews if they like Obama or Netanyahu, are they for the Iran deal or against the Iran deal, they can give you the answer. If you ask them, who are the Jewish people? What is Jewish nationalism? What is the meaning of Zionism? Why is there a Jewish state? Why is there a Jewish state in the place where the Jewish state is? They would literally not know how to begin to answer because they have forgotten both first principles and they have forgotten historical knowledge. One of the reasons that BDS is so terrifying to them and to their children on campuses is because the American Jewish community forgot to pack Jewish knowledge with their kids' lunch when they sent them to college. And, you know, BDS is, after all, very easy to refute. Very easy to refute. But you need to have a certain degree of historical knowledge, and you need to have a certain degree of intellectual sophistication about ideas. Neither of these things seem to matter terribly much, even to American Jews who get hysterical about BDS. I mean, I'm one of those people who believes that Hillel is wrong in keeping BDS out of Hillel. I do not think we can be against political correctness and keep BDS out of Hillel. But the reason I want the BDS people to come into Hillel is so that Jewish kids can see how easy they are to refute and how easy they are to disprove on condition that they have read some history about the conflict and about the history of the Jews and that they know something about their own damn identity. And too many of them do not. And that is one of the reasons for this problem and this hysteria.
We have one final question that's interesting. And it's interesting, I think, because of Bernard's book and also maybe because of zoomed out sort of bird's eye view perspective on this. It's also rather presumptuous, so I think it's interesting too.
What is it, Alana?
Don't tell us.
It's okay, I don't want to tell you. You all write so lovingly about Judaism, Bernard, particularly in The Genius of Judaism, yet none of you seem to be religiously observant. How are the two linked or not?
I'm the least observant of all.
How do you know?
And
Right.
I never write about Judaism.
No.
And that's because I leave it to them.
Well,
and,
Judaism writes about you, my friend.
and I don't have to. And the reason is that the question about Jewish socialism is a great question. As I say, we have a noble tradition. We have a noble tradition in New York, which is the tradition of the old unions, the Jewish socialists of the 20s and 30s. That tradition is actually completely sufficient to me.
I think there's something I think there's something underneath the question, which is I'm psychoanalyzing the questioner now for a second, but it's a desire for some common languages about what it means to be Jewish. And there's a need to be able to speak to Jews who aren't like you. And so I think that what the question is are any of you speaking to Jews that don't possibly look like the Jews who are in this room? I think that's...
What does it mean to look like?
Look, it's an armchair psychology. I just did.
Look, I invite the questioner to meet me in shul this Shabbos. And we'll sit down with some texts and we'll see who knows about Judaism and why and so on. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the idea that it is true that secondly, the Jews are many things. They are a religion, they are a culture, they are a people, they are a civilization. The attempt that I've witnessed my whole life about trying to arrive at one definition, I've concluded is silly. We are a cluster of things. Right. We are a cluster of things. It's hard for me to imagine our culture and our civilization without its religion and its religious origins, but there are both religious and secular arguments, Jewish arguments for justice. There are both religious and secular Jewish arguments for Israel. There are both religious and secular Jewish arguments for all the things that we believe. And the question, there's something divisive and parochial about the question.
But there is something we can add to that. Is number one, that to be a Jew, according to the masters of Judaism, has never been the real masters. The Talmud, the wise, has never been a parochial affair. To be a Jew is a relationship not to the other Jews, but is a relationship to the rest of the world, first of all, according to most of them. Number two, I'm not sure that Judaism is a religion.
You're not?
Remember what Franz Rosenzweig wrote at the entrance of his school: I am irreligious. This was the board which was at the door of his. And Emmanuel Levinas wrote so many pages about that, about the task and the duty of Judaism, which is not to add some religion, but to suppress some religion, to suppress some religiosity, superstition, and so on. And another thing which is, of course, in the midst of all these debates, quarrels, difference of position, one thing which is common to most of the masters of the Jewish thinking is that what is required from a Jew is to study, is to be intelligent, is to care of the world, and after all of that is to believe. Maimonides says that. Rashi says it. Maharal of Prague said that. What is required is less to believe than to study. And there is a magnificent text from the genius of Vilnius who said, the Christians believe, let it to the Christian to believe, to make the jump to the belief, to embrace the sanctity of the big whole. The Jews are much more modest. They go deeply in the loops and the paradoxes and the uncertainty and sometimes the emptiness and the vertigo of the study, which is exactly the opposite of the creed and the belief. So, no, you can be Jews, even if you are not Christians, if I dare say.
I think that is maybe the best way to end any event.
We will now go to a kosher restaurant.
Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.